this screencast, I briefly cover some of the characteristics of narrative related to plot. Then I discuss plot and the use of emplotment in research. First, let's take a step back and think about just what is narrative. Think of your favorite movie or your favorite novel. Now think about how you would tell someone you haven't seen in a year what you've been up to. These are all narratives. They make sense of the world around us, give meaning to actions and events, and organize our experiences and the meaning we attribute to them by creating a contextualized version of reality. The great novelist Toni Morrison stated that narrative is radical, creating us at the very moment it is being created. We might think of narrative as separate from ourselves or from what we would consider reality, but narrative functions to structure and possibly to constitute our realities and the social, cultural, historical context they are situated in. We then draw on these contexts to continue to make sense of our world and experiences. Several characteristics of narrative support its ability to construct reality and meaning in this way, including narrative's diachronicity, hermeneutic composability, and referentiality. Diachronicity refers to the temporal aspect of narrative. It is the unfolding of events over time. Although time may not be presented as linear, think flashbacks or flash forwards, all action is linked to time. Hermeneutic composability refers to the interpretive work required to understand both what the narrative expresses and what it might mean. This requires connecting the parts of a narrative to the whole, engaging in interpretation that relies on seeing the relations between the parts in the whole. And referentiality is related to this interpretive work. It refers to whether or not a narrative makes sense or seems plausible to us. In other words, it's truth. Jerome Bruner stated, narrative, truth, is judged by its verisimilitude rather than its verifiability, where verisimilitude is simply a sense or a feeling of being real. Narrative then concerns time, connections, experience, and place that construct meaning. It can be a tricky thing to nail down, although it's central to our communicating and sense-making. Narrative is the primary scheme by which human existence is rendered meaningful. For those of us in the social sciences interested in exploring how and what is rendered meaningful, how can we use narrative in our research? Enter narrative inquiry. Narrative inquiry is used in many disciplines such as education, psychology, sociology, medical, discourse and literary studies, and counseling. Narrative inquiry is interested in people's experiences as they play out over time, in a place, and in relation, or how they connect and interact together in a whole situation. There are many ways to engage in a narrative inquiry study, and I recommend you check out the resources at the end of the presentation to get you started. But overall, narrative inquiry will involve examining our participants' narratives and/or constructing narratives. A key concept that we must attend to in order to carry out this work is plot. When you hear the word plot, what do you think? Do you think boy meets girl, boy makes mistake, boy wins girl back, or at an even higher level of description like comedy, tragedy, or farce? You'd be right either way. Plot involves the structure of a narrative, but it's also more than structure. I introduced the three characteristics of narrative earlier: diachronicity, hermeneutic composability, and referentiality, because these are all part of how plot functions. Plot transforms a chronicle or listing of events into a schematic whole by highlighting and recognizing the contribution that certain events make to the development and the outcome of a story. So how is it that plot provides or gives us this recognition of significance? Plots are the causal. They're the meaningful connections between events or actions in a narrative. The connections are made by organizing events and actions into a recognizable framework related to goals, motives, and agents. This framework moves the narrative forward, determines what and what is not meaningful by whether and how it relates to the framework. It does all of this work as well as situating the narrative as occurring at a particular time within a particular social, cultural, and historical context. So how are plots used in narrative inquiry? We might be interested in the plots our participants construct. Through their construction of plot, they indicate to us what's meaningful and why, or at least what they find meaningful to share with us. We might get some insight into their goals, motives, and the identification of important agents in their lives. What's missing from the plot, or the way the plot surprises us by breaching expected norms. All of this reveals much about our participants, their context, and their meaning-making process. In narrative inquiry, we examine participant narratives or construct our own from various data sources, but we're always working with stories, and therefore with plots. Emplotment is the act of fitting a plot, or configuring a plot that fits into a set of events. Fit is an important term here. It indicates that not just any old plot will do. Emplotment is a dialectic process that takes place between the events themselves and a theme which discloses their significance, allowing them to be grasped together as parts of one story. In other words, emplotment is interactive between the events and the construction of their connections in context. In this example, the researcher observed an interaction between an occupational therapist and a patient, focusing on the narrative the occupational therapist constructed with and for her patient through discourse and bodily movements. At the beginning of the observed interaction, the therapist Donna tries to get the patient Sam to comb his hair. He does not want to. She convinces him to begin combing, telling him first it's good for his balance, and then continuing to talk to provoke him to keep combing. The researcher identifies the emplotment work done by Donna as part of the construction of a therapeutic story. This brief example shows how emplotment constructed and reconstructed the context within which the event of combing hair took on multiple meanings. Ultimately, this might help the researcher identify what plots are called on during occupational therapy and whether these plots contribute to therapeutic efficacy. In other words, what the patient and therapist are able to do together. In conclusion, emplotment supports thinking dialectically about your data and the stories both you and your participants tell. Check out the resources on the next few slides if you're looking for more information.